Oh, that's cool. Hi everyone, thank you for being here, thank you for coming. Just a brief resume, we're here in the context of the Lisbon and Sintra Film Festival, because one of the programs we are doing is about prison. So we are organizing different kinds of discussions, films. We are also doing an extension of the festival in 2 prisons. And so it was, of course, totally necessary to have Gina Dent and Angela Davis here with us. They also, just to inform, I think you know, that they recently wrote a book that is called Abolition Feminism Now. It's a collaborative book with Beth Ritchie and Erika Minus also. They're not here with us presently, but they are here with us in any other way. And so the conversation will be mostly about prison and abolition. And after we will talk some time and we will be open the discussion to the public for any kinds of questions. So the first question I wanted to ask is how and why the prison became the center of your activism to both of you.
First of all, good evening, everyone. And I am so happy to be here, as I'm sure is Gina Dent. And this happens to be our very first trip to Portugal. So I will... And even though we've only been here for a day, we've had the opportunity to visit a prison, men's prison,
Linho.
Linho.
Prison Linho.
And we had a really engaging conversation with a number of the men there. Unfortunately, we were originally planning to go to a women's prison today, but you'll tell us why we didn't go.
Because of the strike, because they are having a strike, and the general strike is starting tomorrow, and so they needed to organize all the visits today, so we couldn't go. That's the
so
main
there's
reason.
a general strike?
Yeah,
and
from the guard.
When you say general strike?
From the guard.
Just...
Yeah, just the guard.
A guard
the other parts,
strike.
yeah.
Well, we'll talk about the meaning of working class struggles later. But to address the first question, I have been doing work around prison issues for the vast majority of my life. Initially, I worked in various places in New York and Los Angeles for the freedom of political prisoners. George Jackson, for example, some of you recognize the name George Jackson and the Soledad Brothers. I'm giving you a very abbreviated story, and I'm going to say that as someone who was working to free Bobby Seale, Huey Newton, the members of the Black Panther Party, but also political prisoners in other parts of the world. For example, Nelson Mandela, and political prisoners in Africa, political prisoners in Asia, in South America. It's a very long story, But the abbreviated story is the fact that I ended up going to jail myself as a consequence of working to free political prisoners, as a result of working on the case of the Soledad brothers. And I think I'll say this. During the time I was organizing campaigns to free the Soledad brothers, one of the points that I made constantly was that one never knows when one is going to need the support of a mass movement. And one never knows when one may oneself need that support. And and not so much in order to guarantee that we have the support we need, but in order to guarantee that we have movements that are capable of responding to those who are behind bars, those who have engaged in the kind of political activity that means that they're the targets of racism and repression. And so that's what happened to me. That was the point that I was going to make. Shortly after I began to do this intense organizing around the case of the Soledad brothers, I ended up going to jail myself. I found myself charged with murder, kidnapping, and conspiracy, all of which at that time were capital crimes. So when I went to jail in 1970, August 1970 was the uprising at the Marin County Jail. And I ended up spending something like 18 months in jail and on trial. And I'll just make one comment in relation to that. I had been doing work around jails, work around prisons for a long time. But they were primarily men political prisoners. They were primarily men's jails. And so when I went to jail myself, I was absolutely amazed that there were so many aspects of the prison system that had to do with gender that were never acknowledged. Of course, we were just at that time beginning to develop a movement around gender issues, specifically around gender violence. It was just at the very beginning. And since then, it seems as if my whole life has acquired it's been a life devoted to working to free political prisoners, to free all prisoners, to abolish the prison and the police. So I don't know what else I can say.
Well, good evening. I know that you know who Angela is, but I thought it might be fair to tell you who I am. I'm a scholar and an activist in the United States. I teach at the University of California, Santa Cruz. And I'll probably elaborate more through the questions. I think it's easier that way. Won't take up so much time. But Angela and I were Thrilled to have worked with two amazing colleagues on the book we just published, which unfortunately is not yet available in Portugal. We hope there will soon be a Portuguese translation. There's one that's going to be published in Brazil. And so I know it won't immediately come here, but hopefully it will soon. Although we're speaking English in Portugal, which I did not expect. So apparently there are a lot of English readers here. I want to thank you for coming out and for your interest in this issue. I myself came to this issue partly because as a young activist who also started to study Black history and African American studies, prison was an unavoidable issue. And so I came to the issue of political prisoners, and I came to the issue of racial justice, which required a look at the prison system from that point of view. I hadn't yet learned to think as an abolitionist at that time. This was in the 1980s. But I was also, I am also the daughter of a psychiatrist, a Black psychiatrist who I saw throughout my life go from working with very poor patients who had some medical health care, who needed psychiatric attention, to knowing that those patients could no longer afford to get medical care, and that increasingly those patients were inside of prisons inside California. So my father, for the last years of his professional life, he closed his private practice, he stopped working at a hospital, and he moved to work at a prison, because prisons had started to absorb all of the functions that used to occur in the free world. But as my father explained, what he expected to be able to do inside the prison was impossible. There was no talk therapy, there was no real therapy at all, only medications and only constraints. And so, toward the end of his life, he himself became an abolitionist, partly because he encountered that possibility through me and through my colleagues and friends, and because he himself was so disgusted by what he experienced and saw. And so I have been engaged in working against prisons since the late 90s, officially, and I am always aware in doing that work that it's the most profound entry to thinking about class, race, gender, sexuality, and the way in to so many questions we need to study and understand about the world.
So now a little bit about abolition, which is, I wanted you to share how the concept and the idea of abolition evolved during your time of activism and how it is also now. How do you consider it now?
Well, actually, the concept of prison abolition is almost as old as the concept of the prison itself. And I think it's important that when people reflect on the abolition of these institutions of repression that are so steeped in racism, it is important to recognize that these are not eternal institutions, that they have not always existed. The institution of the prison, the institution of police, these institutions have been so naturalized that we often assume that we cannot live in human society without the need for such institutions of repression. I personally became aware of this abolitionist trend, of this history of calls for an end to prisons and an end to the death penalty. I think it's really important to remember that the call for the abolition of the prison is not separate from the call for abolition of other state punishments. And in the US, you're probably aware that the US is one of the few countries in the world where the death penalty is meted out pretty routinely. Somebody is sentenced to death, probably every couple of weeks. So yeah, I personally was introduced to the concept of abolition when I was in jail. And when the Attica uprising took place in September of 1971. It was just after George Jackson was assassinated, was killed in San Quentin prison. There was a massive uprising in upstate New York in this men's prison, which is called Attica. As a matter of fact, if any of you know the work of Michel Foucault, you may know that as much as he wrote about prisons, he was not allowed to visit a prison in France. The first prison he actually visited was Attica in the aftermath of the uprising. Well, in September of 1971, when vast numbers of prisoners refused to go along with the daily routine, they decided that they wanted to make their demands heard for better conditions. Of course, the basics, just better food, better living conditions, which means fewer than 3 or 4 people piled into a single cell. So they made a whole list of demands related to the conditions of living behind bars. But they also call for the abolition of the prison. And that was something, that was a demand that had never been heard in that way in the context of a movement organized around prison issues. And for a short period of time in the US, conversations began to happen around abolition. Judges and other prominent figures began to take abolition seriously. The problem is that usually doesn't last that long. Just as we were taking structural racism seriously in conjunction with the 20s. My temporality is getting all screwed up here because I'm talking about 1971, and then I'm also talking about 2020, and I also have a cold. I apologize. There was a period in the 70s up to the 80s where there was serious conversation about the possibility of abolishing prisons. And the Quakers, it's the American Friends Services Committee, but the religious group, the Quakers, right? Yeah. So it's interesting because they had been the ones originally to offer the prison as an alternative to the horrendous repressive forms of punishment that existed up until then. And they led the call for an end to prisons during that period. And I said before, it was very exciting. One can look at the literature that was written during that time, the conversations that happened. But then, I don't think that we attended to the tendency, the conditions surrounding these public debates, because within a relatively short period of time, people were talking about the need to make prisons more repressive again. And so, as a matter of fact, there's been a kind of pendulum effect. Prisons are clearly racist and repressive. We build a movement, make demands to lessen that racism and repression. They're effective. Small reforms happened, but then the pendulum swings in the other direction, and then what we have is another moment in which prisons become more racist, more repressive, more violent, and yeah. Of course, I could continue to speak, but I'm not going to.
We have time.
I'm trying to treasure brevity. So,
the origins of abolitionist thinking, as Angela was pointing out, can be placed in many places, and obviously we date the contemporary movement to Attica, but I think one thing potentially to add is that in the U.S. context, the arguments against imprisonment extend also from anti-slavery abolition, and so increasingly, it's understood by people who are doing work against racism. It's understood that the abolitionist movement of the slavery period up until the mid-19th century is really unfinished work, and that the work of abolitionism now is an extension of that work, a necessary extension because of what continued in terms of slavery. And the word slavery there becomes somewhat an analogy and somewhat historically specific, meaning some people have referred to the raise and rich policing and jailing were extended from the period of slavery, but also to something in the US Constitution, which you may know from the film 13th, which is that in the US Constitution, the 13th Amendment abolished slavery, quote, except as a punishment for crime. Now, that amendment has actually, from a technical legal standpoint, it no longer holds. There's a case, I'm not going to explain the long legal history, but there's a case that makes imprisoning people and forcing them into labor illegal. However, I think we know from the practices of incarceration that labor is still a very important question when it comes to prisons. And so there's a complex set of questions that involve slavery, racism, enduring structural violence, and the legal system. To this, we have more recently added the problem of settler colonialism, the attempted enslavement of indigenous people who were the first slaves in the Americas, the eradication or the attempt at eradication of the indigenous civilizations. And at the same time, there is currently an attempt to add to an abolitionist agenda the abolition of police. So it is no longer about dividing policing from punishment, but rather considering the entire criminal legal system to be something that needs to be interrogated. And this also means thinking about borders and violence at the border, not thinking about the violence at the border as something that is committed by people who are trying to migrate, but instead thinking about the violence at the border in terms of policing and detention. As prison abolitionists, we spend as much of our time as we can going inside prisons, especially when we travel, or at home and as we travel. But it's also important to point out that there are some spaces that we cannot see, and those spaces include the spaces of border detention. So the evolution of the concept of abolition continues, and of course, after 2020, with the uprisings that I think you all know about, this became a much more popular call, and at the same time, in 2022, it's also a much more challenging call.
And you define, and also in the way you fight against prison, it's a way that you consider abolition like a movement and something we need to construct. So not in the point of view, starting point of destruction, not that destruction, but you need to do this construction, and so starting to work on all the society and also, so how I wanted to, if you could explain a little bit how abolition redefine the relation also between punishment and crime, and how it redefine these two concepts in our society.
I'm going to be brief. Just to answer the first parts, because Angela has the example. Abolition is often perceived by those who are unfamiliar as a purely destructive project. I mean, it's a revolutionary project for sure, but I think many people are confused by it because they think of it as just leaving everything as it exists today, with all of the forms of violence and structural inequality, and opening up the prisons that exist and just hoping everything will be fine. But abolitionists, of course, are much more both practical and imaginative, and so abolition is a building process. It is really about making the world that we need. It's about reinvesting in certain things that have been lost, for example, mental health care, but not necessarily the older versions. It's about trying to forge a different sense of inclusion and societal responsibility and community. And at the same time, abolition requires what Angela has called a disarticulation between crime and punishment. Because one of the most important arguments for abolition is the problem of criminalization, meaning just by virtue of how much money you have, what you can and cannot afford, what color you are, and several other factors, but those usually tend to be the most important. Sometimes your citizenship, depending on whether or not you have the privileged kind or not. The things that tend to have you end up in prison. In other words, I think we know that not everyone who commits the same offense or same harm will have the same punishment and the same outcome. And because of that, we refer, instead of referring to crime or criminals, to criminalization. It's the process through which people come to be criminalized in society, and of course, many are born criminals, as has been argued. And of course, the process of punishment is often considered or not considered at all because it's only considered a consequence of the unfortunate nature of crime. But in order to think through abolition, we have to disarticulate or separate out those two processes. One is a process which produces people for incarceration, and the other is the process of incarceration, which is often ignored because it's perceived to be the only thing we can do. We might know, for example, the statistics that prove that whether you're in the US or in Portugal or anywhere else, that you're more likely to go to prison if you're darker. But we might say, well, that's an unfortunate consequence of racism, but if we just make the system more fair racially, we can keep the prison system because we must have quote-unquote safety. But abolitionists understand that there's no way to separate out the racism from the practices of incarceration. They have grown together. And so an abolitionist way of thinking about incarceration then requires us to attend to what is claimed by society is accomplished through incarceration. And if society's goals are not being accomplished through incarceration, what else is being accomplished? What else is happening? And why are we depending on a system that has consistently failed to do what it has promised to do, to make us more safe, to make us more whole?
So I guess what I'm not going to say what I was going to say before because I've forgotten what it was. No, yeah, but I think it is really important to recognize, particularly for those of you who are interested in doing work against prisons, abolitionist work against prisons, against the police, that it's very important to recognize this is not a discrete issue. We can't assume that it's possible to get rid of prisons without reorganizing the whole ground of the society. So this is a movement that emerged in the latter 20th century, the early 21st century, precisely as a response to the rise of global capitalism. And precisely because the prison began to be utilized not only in the US, but in so many other countries as a method of addressing those who had been completely shut out of the economy. You know, some of you, I'm trying to look at your faces to gauge how old you are and what you might remember or what you might have a historical memory about. And in the 1980s, of course, we began to witness the increasing globalization of capital. We began to witness the shifting of capital into areas that were clearly profitable and away from the social good. I often say that in my lifetime, I can remember in the United States when it was possible for anyone to go to any hospital and be treated. And that is no longer the case. If you are not able to purchase the commodity that is now called health care, then you may very well die. At the same time, we saw during that period the deindustrialization of steel, of so many different industries, the shifting to Mexico and other countries of manufacturing. And so what about people who were losing out during that process, who were losing their jobs? The auto industry basically shut down in the US. What about people who no longer had the capacity to earn a living? Well, at the same time, as this shift was happening, new prisons were being built. As a matter of fact, during the period of the 1990s, latter 80s, 1990s, more prisons were built in the state of California than had been built during the entire history of the state. And so what does this mean? It meant those people who were already subject to economic repression, those people who were subject to racist repression, were the ones who were going to end up behind bars because they lost their jobs, they had no source of income, because also health care was deteriorating. All of the aspects of globalizing capital. And so when we began to work on the issue of abolishing prisons, this was one of the major arguments that prisons had to be, that we had to begin to think not only of a new way of meting out punishment, not only new forms of addressing the issues that led people to go to prison, but we had to take an even larger perspective and ask, what kind of world do we want to live in? Do we want to live in a world that is policed and incarcerated? Is carcerality and policing going to be the way in which we address the problems produced by capitalism? So I wanted to give that larger perspective as well, because from the very outset, abolitionists were saying that it's not just about dealing with prisons, it's not only about dealing with police, it's about creating a new society. It's about revolutionizing our society. It's about reimagining the way we live with each other. And so this gets back to what Gina said earlier. Well, I'm sorry, I have to have I apologize for having this. I hope I didn't bring this cold to people in Lisbon. It is a cold, though. Let me stop here because my throat is a little...
One of the arguments who were always or sometimes told to legitimize the prison is that okay, but what about rapists and what about pedophiles? What are we going to do with them? Like if there is no prison? And so I wanted also to ask, how do you include that in your in the process of abolition, and also how the question of feminism also is related to your did you understand this concept and related to the abolition process, and also this is related to the new book you just wrote, so it will be an excuse also to speak about that.
You okay? I'll talk. And we will talk about this. So,
I'm gonna ask one. Sorry.
too many jobs for Nish. So the book Abolition Feminism Now, which I know you don't have here, but the book we've been working on, we worked on with two other colleagues who first actually initiated the project. Apparently they had a drink and maybe a couple of more, and they said, oh, we should write a book with 4 people, which sounds crazy, actually. But I want to mention their work because we started this project because the 4 of us have been involved in a lot of activism and organizing over the past decades. And so we knew each other very well, in a way, and we were always on the edges of meetings or organizing or events. If we were at an abolitionist event, we were thinking, well, why aren't there any feminist challenges to the fact that we only focus on what's happening to men, for example, or we're not focusing on the prison as a gendering institution, or we're not focusing on the problem of the way we're creating more prisoners by making domestic violence violations commensurate with homicide by valuing them through the length of sentences rather than by valuing the people who've been harmed. And so Beth Ritchie, whose lifelong work has been in the anti-violence movement, working against domestic violence, has had a very important set of experiences that contributed to her understandings. And Erica Miners, among other things, who is an education scholar, also has worked on the problem of how we think about sexual offenses and how we treat sexual offenders. And so both of them come from work more specifically. Angela and I, of course, have attended to those issues, but we haven't focused exclusively on those issues. And so working with them was an opportunity to say out loud what we've said in these other abolitionist contexts and in feminist contexts. In feminist contexts, we're saying we don't want a carceral feminism. We don't want a feminism that bolsters and emboldens the prison industrial complex. We don't want to treat gender violence by or even attempt to treat gender violence by expanding the very structures that are harmful. And so working together with Beth and with Erica allowed us to systematically think through this in our book and to really answer the question that always comes up in any audience around abolition, which is, what will we do with the very terrible people?
The bad people.
And yeah, sometimes called the bad people. And there are several answers to this.
Not all bad people, because
it's
there are a lot of bad people who are in political office, for example.
Right.
Most of them.
Yeah. So the point that Angela was just making is who is able to get labeled bad, and of course it's connected to that process of criminalization we were just talking about. Who is criminalized and who is not. And also, the person who's incarcerated, even if they have committed that offense, generally has done something on one day. One act, depending on who you are, can, for example, in the United States, put you in prison for the rest of your life. And we could go on and talk about that. But I think the important thing to answer here, which is really at the heart of your question, is how do we address, especially as feminists, the problem of incarceration without investing further in the very systems that have created more violence? So in the book, we extend this conversation in a lot of ways. But some of the things that people in the domestic violence movement have taught us and know include the fact that police, for example, themselves are often some of the statistically most likely to commit domestic violence. This is true also for prison guards. The existence of police stations and prisons in communities extends that violence. Yeah, I know you're not happy about that, you're just affirming. The problem that we don't create an opportunity for people to unlearn violence inside prisons. In fact, prisons, whether you are a person writing from the political left or the political right, there's an agreement that prisons don't decrease propensity for violence because prisons themselves are such violent places. But the violence of the prison is blamed on the people who are incarcerated there. It's not generally blamed on the system of incarceration itself. So from an abolition feminist point of view, we want to simultaneously attend both to interpersonal violence, that is harm that happens between people, which happens everywhere, unfortunately, and state violence, the violence of the state itself, the violence of incarceration and policing and the criminal legal system. And so if we then attend simultaneously to both of those domains of violence and harm, then we need different answers, because the prison doesn't give us the answers to those problems. There are also times when it's important to point out that even when we use the very expansive characterization of a violent prisoner that the system, for example, in the United States uses, a very small portion of people incarcerated are actually convicted of violent crimes. And a very, very small percentage of those are convicted of acts that are so heinous that separation from the population is required until something can be done. So creating a system which incarcerates millions and millions of people for the very small percentage of people who have done things that are so egregious that we need to be kept away makes no sense unless the prison serves other functions. And that's why abolitionists attend to the prison industrial complex, to racial capitalism, to the gender system, to sexual violence, and to all the various ways in which we are positioned to act toward each other in violent ways.
Oh, is there another question?
You did answer this one, no?
Oh. Oh, okay.
You have
of
something
course,
more to say? No.
I think Gina gave a very expansive response. So I'll only add that these institutions of violence and racism and heteropatriarchy and racism and modes of existence that very specifically attack trans people. Let's remember that jails and prisons are also gendering institutions, and they not only affect those who are inside, and if you are gender nonconforming or trans, well, in most instances, you have to be satisfied with being basically locked up and not allowed to socialize. But because there are prisons that are designed to be women's prisons, prisons that are designed to be men's prisons, what happens to those who do not identify in a straightforward way with either poles of the binary? And I say this because in the course of the work that we've done, we've discovered how important it is to emphasize the social role and the ideological role of the institution, so that it affects not only those who are incarcerated, but it affects everyone else who assents to the existence of these institutions. And I also, wanted to point out that these carceral institutions become models for other institutions. They become models for schools. And, I'm not as familiar with the educational system here in Portugal, but I can tell you that schools in indigenous communities, in Black communities, in Latinx communities have for a long time used the tools and the instruments of the prison. What happens in the process is that learning becomes subordinated to discipline. It's more important for teachers to either assent to or learn how to engage in the process of disciplining children than it is for them to attempt to encourage children to develop a joy of learning. So for the last, 20 years, we've been doing a lot of work on schools, looking at the ways in which school children are treated as if they were prisoners or as if they're on a trajectory towards prisons. And this is how the larger society also begins to accept the existence of these horrendous institutions that are designed to destroy people's spirits. And I'll tell you that Gina and I were, was that yesterday that we were in the prison? Yeah, we were in Linho prison yesterday, and had an amazing conversation about a film that is a part of the film festival here.
From Charles Burnett, who is here with us, I think. Sleep with Anger.
Charles, you can stand up.
Where's Charles? I can't see it. Oh yeah, here's the filmmaker here. And I was thinking as we were engaging in that conversation, if these young men had the opportunity to devote more time to learning and thinking, they would be helping to solve the problems you have, which are many, here in this country. One of which. Well, this is my second day in Portugal, so I always tell my students, before you start criticizing, find something that is good that you can. So I can say that I've met really wonderful people here in Portugal. But I also know that along with other countries in Europe, there has been an attempt ideologically to disassociate from the development of racism and to think of racism as existing somewhere else. And so we were involved in this relatively short, unfortunately, conversation about racism in the prison yesterday. And my thinking was that this should be happening all over this country. And people outside should recognize the intellectual energy that comes from those who are in prison, who decide to try to take advantage of that negative moment to learn and think and read and live the life of the mind. There's just one other point I want to make before I cede the microphone. My voice is going anyway, and that is that I'm reiterating what Gina said, that we can't only think about the specific institution that we call the prison. We have to think about border police and the enormous issues that have risen in recent years, and this is also connected with the globalization of capital and the ways in which people have been compelled to move across borders in order to try to find a better life for themselves. And so part of abolition is also being critical of the assumption that borders are necessary. You know, and this has to do with abolitionists' imaginings, the abolitionist imagination. Why can we not imagine a world that is not structured by repression and violence and police and prison guards? And so this is what we are. I was talking about Portugal, and I think this country could really benefit from an abolitionist movement that would look very specifically at the history of Portugal in relation to slavery, in relation to the slave trade. Thank you.
So both of you pointed out the importance of education, but in a really, I'm talking about education in the natural sense, in the natural aspect, and both education inside and outside, like to create spaces of reflection. There is some ways of thinking about abolition that considers that we shouldn't go inside prisons or teach inside prison or create it because it would be a way of nourishing the system. So the need of just like separate totally and just not going there anywhere, which is not your and if you could speak a little bit about that and how this.
Yes. I also want to say it was an incredible privilege yesterday to be able to go inside. Also, I will say that it was different from the experience of going inside prisons other places I've been, because I've never been allowed to sit in prison watching a movie with people who are incarcerated. And so viewing the film in that context added extra power. On the subject of education, Angela was pointing out that the men we were speaking to yesterday were taking advantage of the opportunity to study and read. They asked us about books and about films and other things. But here's the thing. Many people invest in the idea of prison more because they say, oh, that's the place where these people who have so many problems will be able to learn. I just want to make sure that you understand that we're saying that this should have happened before. That these people that the room full of black men who were inside that prison room should have had the opportunity to study and to learn and to be connected to people before. And of course, the few that we were talking to who had the capacity to get privileges to enter the space and to get access to visitors and books and to be able not to be so damaged from society to be able to read, that of course is a small percentage. So that's the first thing I think we should make sure to say. But within the abolitionist movement, there is a spectrum of opinion on what to do now with the fact that many, many people are creating programs for people who are currently incarcerated. I mean, partly because so many people are, and they don't have access often to advanced educations. Often they don't have access to education beyond high school, if that. And so there, especially in the United States, but I hear that this is happening in many other parts of the world now, there are the creation of prison education programs. And those programs are often run by ordinary universities that establish a program that goes inside the prison. So abolitionists believe in distinguishing between two different kinds of reforms. There are reforms that fortify the prison system, expand the carceral footprint in society, meaning healthcare is not available outside for mental health, so people are incarcerated to get mental health, as I spoke about earlier, or education's not available, so then they have it inside prisons. And so a reformist reform is just an expansion of the prison industrial complex. Now, a non-reformist reform, which is also a change. This concept comes from Andrzej Gorsz, and it's popularized for us by Tomasz Matthiessen, if you want to look it up. It's referenced in almost every abolitionist leading book. But the important part is that we are investing in the things that treat the harm now and also are about an abolitionist future. So non-reformist reforms have to balance temporality. They have to think differently in terms of time. They have to both be present-focused, because we can't ignore the violations that are happening, and they have to be future-focused, because we have to know that we're moving away from incarceration as a failed system. And so a non-reformist reform would mean, okay, people are currently incarcerated. They have been denied access to education. We want them to have education, but then we have to ask a lot of other questions. What ways is this education liberatory? What is the content of the education? Who's delivering it? Are people inside allowed to become teachers? Are guards the ones who are enforcing the system of education and haunting the rooms where people are studying? Or do people have some relative autonomy? Can people leave a prison to go to a campus to study? Or are they forced to spend more years in prison? So what are the ways in which prison education can become decarcerating? And what are the ways that it just furthers incarceration? We always have to ask that. That's a complex political question. So I would say that what we try to be involved in are things that more obviously look like they have liberatory capacity, but remember, things can always change. There's always contingency. So you may think you have a program which does that, but it might do something different. Let me give you just one more example about that. In the United States, some private institutions, very wealthy institutions, are establishing prison education programs which grant degrees to people inside, which sounds wonderful. However, some of those incarcerated people are taking on debt that is so extreme that if they're able then to return to the free world, they will never get a job with the constraints on people who have been incarcerated that will allow them to pay off those debts. That is not the kind of education that an abolitionist should embrace.
Let me add one other related issue, and it has to do with children. I'm not sure what kind of child services program you have here in Portugal.
Like child protective services, like when someone's taken away from
Yeah.
their family.
How do you call that?
Child protective services. Are you familiar with, oftentimes the authorities will remove a child from their home because there may be some disagreements between the parents or some other issue. Well, and oftentimes it's only because of the fact that the parents cannot afford a good apartment, a place to stay. As a matter of fact, in the U.S., oftentimes children are taken away because of the poverty of the parents, which is absolutely ridiculous. It would seem as if they would help the parents. And so, based on the work that Dorothy Roberts and others have done, there is a tendency now to refer to this system as the family policing system. Because one can see that precisely the kinds of policing strategies that have been responsible for the racist assaults on so many, the death of so many, that strategy is applied to what is supposed to be a way of helping children. And in the process, of course, the entire families, and especially the children, suffer as a consequence. And I also wanted to say, in relation to Gina's remarks, that we don't see abolition as replacing one institution with another. So it's not about better prisons, because that has been the whole history of the prison system from the very outset, from the very invention of the prison system. The effort has been to build better and better prisons. As a matter of fact, Foucault pointed out that the whole history of the prison is the history of efforts to reform the prison from the very outset. And you know how sometimes people, they just keep doing the same thing over and over again? It doesn't work. I mean, I don't know whether any of you have done it and have, come to the conclusion, well, I tried this 10 times. And if I try it one more time, it means that I'm not paying attention to something really important here. But that is precisely the history of the prison. The kinds of reforms that have been introduced over and over and over again. And in the US, and as well as many other countries, what has happened as a consequence is that the institution has become even more repressive than it was when the reforms were introduced. And so how do we break that cycle? How do we imagine something new? In order to imagine something new, you can't think about, okay, let's build a prison over here that's going to be a better prison. What we try to do is look at the whole and try, for example, when you're talking about the police, when you see so many police engaging in that kind of repressive and often racist behavior of shooting people who have mental problems and who need help. I mean, I don't know whether this is happening here in Portugal, but I'm pretty sure it probably is. That so many instances when people need help, they need compassion because they have emotional or mental issues, and then you call the police, and the police are trained to deal with situations with their weapons. And so you should be able to predict that if the police arrive, that somebody is probably going to get shot, maybe even killed. So what if we reimagine the ways in which, particularly people who have mental or emotional issues, are assisted? Now, what if we think about helping them? What do we think about being compassionate as opposed to responding to a police matter? Well, what we're trying to suggest is that we can rethink what it means to be safe. You know, what it means to experience security. The first thing I want for security is I don't want weapons. I don't want guns around. And, you know, that might sound radical, but
it's good.
You know, why can't we imagine not only, well, in the U.S., of course, we have to deal with civilian guns because there are more people who have guns in our country than anywhere else in the world.
More guns than people.
That's true. And
That's not an exaggeration.
And there are more guns than there are people in the population. That is true. But, you know, why don't we call for a disarming, not only of civilian populations, but disarming of police as well? And then disarming of armies, that is what we might call an abolitionist imagination. It's not going to happen now, but we can at least imagine what it might feel like to live in a society that is not so determined by all of these modes of violence everywhere.
So I think it will be the last question before we open to the public. It's more like a help question or tips, because abolition is not also something that it's really or usually speak or ask in Europe. I think it's really more present in the present in America, in all the discussion, not only in the activists but also in the with the academics. So maybe if you understand why, or if you have a thought why it's still not so present in Europe, and how it is a subject that we could more put in our their daily life. And so it's not the last question. There will be another one after. Well, no, we can speak about culture actually, because
You mean about the fact that Europe has not necessarily been a place where abolition has, but that's not true, actually. This is not true, because when I think about the philosophical literature, the legal literature that has been published in places like the Netherlands and you know, also even Belgium.
Scandinavia.
Scandinavia. So And of course, many people assume that prisons in Scandinavia are the best prisons because you know, people who end up getting charged under the International Criminal Court, when they're asked where they want to do their time, almost inevitably they'll say, you know, Scandinavia, Norway, or Sweden. But Scandinavian prisons over the last 20 years have become even more repressive than they were, I would say, since the 1980s, that same process that we were talking about before.
We know why, because they're incarcerating more and more migrants and people of color.
You know, that is true, and you have this dilemma where Europe still imagines itself, I'm talking about Europe imagining itself as white. And that flies against the realities of Europe. You know, we've said on many occasions that we visit certain countries and don't see that many black people around. But then we go into the prison and then we figure out, oh, yes. And we had that same experience yesterday, did we? The same experience here in Portugal.
And so the last question, which is about the culture, also for you to speak a little bit about your work, the work you're doing, but the importance of the culture for the visualization of abolition and of prisons also, and the importance of the way of using this medium, which can be images, cinema, photographies, etc.
Okay. We're debating who goes first. So one of the reasons I was especially happy to be able to come is that part of the abolitionist work that I've been doing for a long time is on the relationship to culture. By that, referring specifically to often popular culture, but often film, television, and art. And so recently, in the last 3 years or so, started a project called Visualizing Abolition at the university where I work. But the project is fine, you can look it up if you like, but the reason to raise it is because of the connection to being here, which is, you know, why a film festival would have a sub-theme on prisons and incarceration, and also how necessary it would be to treat that subject matter as something that needs to have other elements, such as lectures and other experiences, like going into the prison, in order to make that introduction more important. And the thing that I guess I would start out saying, and it's something that we've talked about for a very long time, is the role that our culture plays in establishing the prison as a norm. We could describe this many ways, but one of the things I often say is from the earliest period of filmmaking, the prison has been present in film. There is no history of film without the history of prison. In fact, one of the first films Edison made was a film that was a reenactment of an execution. And so, if the entirety of our filmic culture is grounded in prisons as existing in our landscape, it is a very difficult task, considering how much our societies are permeated by these cultural products, to imagine ourselves beyond the prison. And so tackling that issue and tackling the predominance of issues of crime and punishment in media and in film and in television is incredibly important. Of course, it's also novels and many other things. But it's also important now, and this is the project that I'm engaged in, to challenge the ways in which we have, even as activists sometimes, but especially as scholars, bowed to the social sciences and the data-driven work to determine our agendas. So maybe you know where I'm going with this, huh? One of the ways that artists are often treated as if they should illustrate what those who are criminologists or sociologists or legal professionals know about the system of incarceration. But we've found ourselves in the very difficult problem of having years and years of research. As long as the prison has existed, there's been research around it, showing its damage, and yet the very ways in which that data are collected have to do with the securing the prison system rather than liberating us from it. So the project, thank you for, I tend not to take space between sentences. The project is really about thinking about what would it mean to start from imagination, to start from creative professionals and those who are just doing creative work, to think not only about how people inside prisons can have access to more creative work, which is often considered extra or unimportant, and that they only do because they're kind of treated like children who should draw and paint. Someone knows what's going on there. But instead, thinking about how we can more systematically train people into thinking about, through the aesthetic, to thinking about problems from that vantage point, to helping to imagine and to think about how we know by starting with art, with artists and with non-professionals who create in order to try to get us to imagine this other future. So instead of following all of the data scientists, we can instead lead. We can lead with creativity, we can lead with imagination, we can lead with justice. I'm going to stop because this is a topic I could talk about all day, but I do want to say that it's incredibly wonderful to be here with all of you. And one of the things we do in the book we worked on together with our co-authors is we use a lot of the images that are ephemera from our work as activists and things that people have shared with us. And we treat those images not as high cultural artworks that we need to analyze in that way, but as some of the ways that people have come to know differently and some of the work that artists have done that contributes to our struggle and helps us to know differently. And we were presented with this flyer. When we entered today, and we've been hearing about Danny Joy and about Danielle. Yes. We need to know, well, we know what happened. We need to have the state acknowledge what happened to them. We need to ensure that people do not suffer this way and that the state does not have the capacity to cover up this suffering and violence, that the state can't act like prison culture is the culture that people inside who are incarcerated have, but it's the culture that the state has. Prison culture is violent, but we are describing the state. We are not describing the people who are inside.
what I would like to point out is that we keep those of our siblings, our comrades, we keep their memory alive by doing the kind of activism that will guarantee ultimately that this happens to no one else. And so I'm thinking about Daniel and Danny Joy as martyrs in this movement to eventually abolish prisons in this place. And I want you to think about the fact that not very long ago, in the summer of 2020, a young man by the name of George Floyd was killed by the police using a chokehold that was apparently designed by the Israeli military. I'm just, trying to complicate, what happened, and for us to think about, all of the various ways in which military repression, police repression combine to create such tragedies. Now, in the summer of 2020, in May of 2020, people all over the world were impressed by the extent to which, at first in the US, but also in Palestine and other parts of the world, so many people poured out into the streets. You remember those images, don't you? And you remember that it was even more impressive because we did not understand fully the way the pandemic affected human beings. More people poured out into the streets of major cities in the US than ever before in the history of the United States. More white people went out at their own risk to join hands with those who were saying no to police violence, no to racism. And I say this because I don't want to forget that moment. Now many people are assuming that that's the past, that it happened at that particular time, but we're beyond that now. And there are all of the efforts to make sure that we don't, all of the official efforts by the state to make sure that we don't hold on to that very precious memory of, I like to use the term that John Berger uses when he says that demonstrations are rehearsals for revolution. Demonstrations are rehearsals for revolution. They allow us to feel that connection with one another. They allow us to imagine what the world might be. And when I think about Danielle and Danny Joy, I think that what we do is we hold their memories close because they can help to teach us what the world might be. And I don't know if the mother of Danielle, or is it the mother of Danielle or the mother of
If
Danielle?
she's I don't know.
Well, I know that you're familiar with her, right? And I just want to point out that amazing set of demonstrations that took place 2 years ago did not happen spontaneously. It didn't happen because people just decided to go out and demonstrate. That was a consequence of the work that has been unfolding over years and over decades and perhaps even longer than that. And one of the points that we tried to make in this book was that you don't always get to see your victories when you are engaging in these daily struggles. You don't always get to experience the kind of victory that you want to experience. However, if we continue to organize, if we continue to struggle, these campaigns add up. And they generate messages, and people who may once have never imagined themselves participating in an uprising, when the moment arises, such as that conjuncture in 2022, they feel compelled to join. So we're organizing not only for tomorrow and not only for the day after tomorrow, but the year after and the decade after and the century after. Because if there is to be a future on this planet, and this is something that is increasingly in jeopardy, it will happen as a consequence of the work of all of you, and particularly the work of young people who are the ones who remind us that the future of this earth is so much in jeopardy. But thank you.
So if you have any question, raise your hand. We're just asking you to take into consideration that there is a lot of people, so if we can short the question and do shorter question and not take long to let space to everyone to do.
Hi, I really liked hearing your discussion. It was really interesting, and I just wanted to thank both of you. And I was just wondering if you could share some examples on how, like, my generation, because I'm 16 and there's a lot of young people here. How we can push for prison abolition and reforms. Yeah.
She's there.
Are we responding to each one?
Yes.
Or are we?
No, you
can. Well, thank you so much for letting us know that you're here and that you're ready to go to work. Young people are closest to the future and have the stakes in producing a habitable future that some of us who are older aren't as passionate about. Although we should be, even though we may not experience that future. It is equally our responsibility to follow young people like you. And I just want to use this opportunity to say that some of us who are older have had our leadership requested. Let me put it that way. But I truly believe, and I believe this when I was young, that leadership has to come from the younger generation. Because young people hopefully tend to be more experimental. They tend to be less stuck in old strategies and old ways of doing things. So I think what I want to do is reverse that question and ask you what you think us older folks should be doing to guarantee that you move forward.
You want to say something?
I wasn't ready for this question, so I really don't know what to answer.
Well, I'm not saying you have to do it right now. You can think about it.
Yeah, you can write to us later and let us know what we should do. But I think the important thing is to say that you probably have a good understanding of what is wrong and what you've already seen, and the way you might explain it because of what you're perceiving, it will be helpful to all of us. So never underestimate what you have to contribute right now.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Katia, and thank you so much for your lecture today. So my question is, from the perspective of an abolitionist, considering what we can learn about the prison system, what are the extensions of this harmful system to what I would call an open prison system, such as the maintenance of ghettos in the city plannings and the limitations of liberties and emancipations of those that live in these places, as you said, so well gave us an example such as the educational system. Thank you.
I've been tasked with answering because I heard it a little bit better, I think. You know, some of these answers would require a lot of time, because this is a question about, you know, first of all, why cities look the way they do, why certain people live where they are forced to live, why some people with generational wealth can pass on large homes, why, you know, other people who migrate to a space, you know, when migration was thought of as something that, for example, we were talking about Scandinavia, when people were migrating from one Scandinavian country to another, from one European country to another, certain Scandinavian countries were giving years of language training, money, all kinds of social welfare supports, right? Those are eroding when different kinds of people are moving in. Suddenly, there's no housing to give, there's no social support to give, there's no money for linguistic training, etc. So, you know, there's a reason, I don't know if you use the same expression here, what we call people who design cities, we call them city planners, right? So we have, for example, someone like Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who's a geographer who focuses on critical human geography, so, which is a field which is rethinking, you know, how we have planned, not only how we've planned cities, but how we think about geographies, but also how we can critically engage with them. And so I think it's most important to point out that these are not accidental. I do also want to say, though, that a false integration, which forces people of color or people from certain communities to need to be in white neighborhoods to be safe or to have good schools, is also not the answer. Because as people who came from segregated United States, you know, there are many ways in which the destruction of integration has actually created more harm than segregation. Meaning, did I say it wrong? The destruction, in other words, if I said it wrong, she says I said it wrong. What I'm saying is integration is perceived as the answer. That what we should do is have basically a white cultural framework in which we introduce all kinds of other people of color, because they will obviously want to live the same way as white people. When we know that what mostly people want is to have access to those better things that living in those communities, provide. So some of the things that were problems of the mode of integration that happened in the United States, they leave still really poor neighborhoods, which happen also to be neighborhoods of Black and brown people, and yet there's ostensibly no legal reason why those communities are left that way. So as you can see, I'm gearing up for a long lecture on this, and I don't have time for a long lecture. But I guess what's important in terms of incarceration is that we also know that those are the neighborhoods from which people are brought to prisons. And we know that in the high crime areas that are white, wealthy communities where people use a lot of drugs or do other things or whatever they do in their own homes, their privacy is protected. They are largely kept from going to jails and prisons. They have access to legal support. They also have access to the expectation that they are law-abiding, even when they're not. So there's a lot of work to do, not only with how we arrange our societies, but also how we treat people when they settle where they would like to be with people who make them feel at home.
And we need to beware of instantaneous solutions, easy solutions. In the US now, virtually every institution has a diversity, equity, and inclusion. Are you familiar with that concept? I see things travel so much faster. Diversity.
We're sorry. We come
equity,
from the US and we bring a lot of bad things. I'm sorry.
And the assumption is diversity, equity, and inclusion is all of these things are great. All of these things are going to get us where we want to go. But we have to constantly engage in critical responses, particularly when we see the speed with which ideology takes shape and congeals. Equity, well, let me start with diversity. Diversity is supposed to be a good thing because we want diversity, don't we? But why do we want diversity? What's good about diversity? And what kind of diversity do we want? I just want to say that I don't like diversity when it's simply a question of bringing into an existing frame people who are different racially, different with respect to gender, etc. Now, why do I say that? Why do I say that? Because it's possible to create this process of diversity or integration, going back to your comments, Gina, without in any way changing the nature of the institution that is trying to become so diverse. So what sense does it make to bring those who have been previously excluded, those who have been previously left on the outside, marginalized, bring them into the frame without changing the frame at all? You're simply asking those who were marginalized to participate in the process of reproducing racism or heteropatriarchy within that frame. I mean, do you understand what I'm saying? We can't. So, I like that. So, you know,
Another question.
we always have to be critical. This is one of the reasons why critical race theory has been targeted by, you know, all of the races or anything with critical in it. But of course, all you have to do is put critical in front of something, and then you assume that the problem is solved, right? That's not working either. I think I'll conclude this question by saying that we have to, we really have to think with each other. We have to think deeply with each other. This was one of the really wonderful things about writing this book that Gina has been talking about. We thought we already knew what we were going to write about because we've all been activists and we've all written about all of those subjects. But once we started to write the book, we realized how different all of us were and how little we actually knew. And so I want to encourage you to, you know, not try to move away from not knowing, but recognizing that often not knowing is the very best way in which you can imagine something new, imagine something different. So instead of diversity, inclusion, what was the other thing? What about justice? What about freedom? You don't hear those words circulating around.
Well, hi. I'm Alexa. No one else introduced themselves, I think. I'm not sure. I'm sure there's a lot of people here who would grab this mic and say so many wonderful things. I see so many faces of people who do amazing work here in Portugal. I wanted to say 2 or 3 things. First of all, I wish you had a table to put your cups on.
Yeah, sorry about that.
I just wish you did. Second of all, I wish there was translation. I wish. There's so many of us here who might not get half of what you're saying just because you're speaking in English. O que eu estou a dizer é que eu gostava que eles tivessem uma mesa para pôr as canecas. E a segunda coisa que eu gostava que tivesse acontecido é que houvesse tradução para que muitas das pessoas que estão aqui não percebessem só metade daquilo que está a ser dito. Also, there would have been volunteers to do that. Haveriam pessoas voluntárias para fazer isso, sem problema. That being said, I think there are 2 things that haven't been mentioned, ou há 2 coisas que eu acho que podiam ser mencionadas, which is the problem of nationalism and the ideas of national identity, portanto, a questão do nacionalismo e a ideia da identidade nacional. I'm a social worker. Eu sou assistente social and an activist, uma ativista. And one of the things that I do is I go to schools and I talk to teachers, and I was talking about anti-racist education with teachers. And one of the things that we debated on was on police and the need of police. Eu fui há uns tempos atrás falar com professores acerca de educação anti-racista. E uma das coisas que nós debatemos foi sobre polícia. And you can't imagine how much these teachers were actually saying, yes, you know, one of the things that we need the most is to keep policing. And e estes professores, a maior parte deles até mulheres, né, mulheres cis, diziam, sim senhor, a gente tem que continuar a ter polícia nas ruas e isto é muito importante. So what I'm trying to say is that, I guess a question also is, how can we take these matters into our communities, into the schools? What would you say are like useful tools? And into bringing this thinking into other spaces that are not mostly white, where people had the money to pay to listen to you guys, which is wonderful, and it's such a privilege, and thank you so much for being here, by the way. Mas o que eu estou a dizer é que como é que a gente pode levar estes assuntos para outros lugares que não são este, não é? Que não são onde as pessoas pagaram para vir falar sobre isto. Estas pessoas incríveis e maravilhosas que, claro que é incrível e temos o privilégio imenso de estar aqui hoje. By saying this, I also want to talk about imperialism and how do we dismantle it. Because we were talking about borders and about how this also feeds into systems of incarceration, and it makes abolition talks so different, so difficult. O que eu estou a dizer também é porque que muitas vezes estes sistemas imperiais que nós conhecemos, muitas vezes também fazem com que falar sobre abolicionismo seja tão difícil. So I really wanted to ask, in this very complex world, in this very complex things, I mean, we are, as we speak, there are young people occupying schools because of the fossil industry here in Portugal, and are being taken into jail or into trial because of peaceful manifestation in schools and in universities. So this is happening as we speak. So we kind of, right? Portanto, enquanto nós estamos aqui a conversar, estão escolas a ser ocupadas por causa do movimento fóssil e de tudo aquilo que está a acontecer no ambiente aqui em Lisboa. And so I just really wanted to leave with this note, which is sometimes we bring things from the US, etc. We've seen how integration happens, for instance, here in Lisbon, in Alta de Lisboa. So, Alta de Lisboa, quem não conhece, foi um projeto de integração, ou uma tentativa de projeto de integração em que numa rua tens pessoas de comunidade cigana e noutra rua tens pessoas brancas, e que só fez com que tipo, as pessoas entrassem com o carro num prédio e no outro se vissem aquelas histórias muito engraçadas de hortas dentro de casas de banho e coisas do género. And so I just kind of really also wanted to say that when we talk about global things and we look into what is happening outside and in the US, etc., also I would ask for people who are here to look into what is happening here in Portugal, in our communities. Portanto, olharem para o que está a acontecer cá em Portugal, o que é que está a acontecer aqui, porque estes exemplos são também para nós aprendermos e para nós olharmos para o que é que nós podemos fazer aqui hoje, agora. O global também é isto, não é? Como é que a gente pode agir localmente. So I just, going back to my question, and I tend to lecture also, and so going back to my question is, how would you say, from your experience and from all of these complexities, give us some words and some advice and some nurture, some care, I don't know, that would support us in what we need to do here and what is happening right now. Thank you so much. Obrigada.
Thank you so much, and I do think that especially during this period, it is important to recognize the way in which imperialism has become so much more dangerous, all over the world. And I'm thinking about the fact that there's a war going on in Europe. I'm thinking about Ukraine. But I'm also wanting to, as you pointed out, think within a complicated frame, to not be satisfied with simple answers. And as we challenge Russian imperialism, we also acknowledge the extent to which people from Africa and other parts of the world are facing forms of racism in Ukraine as they attempt to get out of the country, as they attempt to, students, for example, students from all over Africa have been subject to racism in Ukraine. So I think that what we should emphasize is an openness and a way of thinking deeply and critically and differently. I would like to, as I said before, imagine a world in which there are no borders. I would like to be able to envision the kind of world that will allow us to allow us to be without war, to allow us to abolish prisons, abolish police, not for the sake of simply getting rid of these terrible institutions, but for the sake of figuring out how we can all live together on this planet, not only with humans, but with the other beings with whom we share this planet. So that if going back to the intervention by the amazing 16-year-old who asked the question over there, we need some real help. We have to figure out, what to do, or else this planet is not going to be habitable for a very long time. And I'm not thinking primarily of ourselves as humans. I'm thinking about all of the inhabitants of this earth, because, species come and go, and the human species is no different. And I think sometimes we have to think in that capacious way in order to figure out what work we do right now in order to help guarantee a future, in order to help others imagine a world without racism, without violence. And I often come back to the era of slavery in the U.S. Gina led off with that question about abolition, because abolition, of course, gets its inspiration from the abolition of slavery. And not so much its inspiration, but rather it's also we get our cautions. Because the assumption was, when various amendments were passed, when presidents announced that slavery was abolished, the assumption was that all you had to do was one thing to get rid of slavery. Those who were the on-the-ground activists, I'm sure, had a long-term vision. I'm certain that while they did not necessarily know what it would be like to inhabit a world no longer polluted by slavery, they knew that as a consequence of the work that they were doing then, and it was basically black people who won the so-called Civil War. And they recognized that we would benefit from the work that they did then. They didn't know who we were. They didn't know exactly how, but there was this word, freedom, that inspired them to do work to create a new set of circumstances in the country and in the world that they would not get to experience themselves. And I say that because I think we have to attempt to move out of the capitalist paradigm so that we're not always only thinking about ourselves. And when I say this, we can't always only be thinking about ourselves as humans. We don't know that the human species is the most important. We don't know what is going to be happening thousands of years from now, but we can help to create a better place for those who come after us. We can do that work to let, what's your name? What?
Mariana.
We must let Mariana know. Mariana is the 16-year-old who asked the question earlier. And, this is what we have to do for ourselves and for the future.
I'm sure we're out of time, and I just wanted to say that there was a lot in both your comment and in your questions. We've been in Portugal for the first time, and it's been approximately 36 hours. So intentionally, there was very little mention of local conditions. However, I will say that in just a short amount of time, we've already been in touch with and learned about organizations and work happening here, and I'm happy to hear about more of it. We hadn't heard actually about the occupying of the schools, and so this is it's really important to know. Angela spoke about imperialism, but I also want to speak about the form of U.S. imperialism and linguistic imperialism that you started out with. Desculpe for falar em inglês. It's hard to the problem of U.S. imperialism, and it's something we really struggled with in writing our book, and it's unfortunate that it's not yet here in Portuguese, but we know it will be soon. But one of the things we struggle with is U.S. imperialism, not only in the forms that it's most known for, but in these other forms in which ideas get sent and transferred, the kind of sense of superiority that U.S. people often travel with. This is something that I want you to understand that we think deeply about, and it's the reason for not mentioning more than what we have heard mostly from people who asked us to speak to issues was that it will take some time and some other meetings and some other experiences to have something to contribute beyond what we have brought. However, the book we wrote takes an internationalist framework. It takes a framework which is anti-capitalist, and it tries to present the work that has been done in many parts of the world, not only from mentioning examples, but also from being inspired by those examples in terms of our analysis. And so this is our first visit. As someone I hope it's not our last visit, and I look forward to hearing and being a part of the work that is going on here, because the work of abolitionism Prisons are unfortunately a global problem. The prison industrial complex is referred to because it connects all of these structures. And we all need to be in this work together, and we need to understand in the US the work that is being done in other parts of the world.
One more question?
Hello. I would just like to, it's a very small question. My name is Sarah, thank you for your talk. And I would like to ask you if in your travel around Europe, you spoke about Lisbon, Norway, and then you go to the prisons, and then you are suddenly certain that because on the streets you don't see that so many African people, and then there are so many inside prisons. And I would like to make the question the way around. When you go to the talks, aren't you surprised that the audience is mainly white? In cities that we have historically a very high predominance of Africans and African descendants people, just as myself proudly, and we are so underrepresented in these type of scenarios. And I would like to ask you, what's the best advice for LEFFEST and all sort of type of these events to increase representativity? Thank you.
Thank you so much for, did you say your name? Did you say your name? Sara. So you are correct mostly. It is often the case that the audiences that are in certain venues are more white than the populations in the surrounding streets. And of course, we already talked about the prison population. This is not always the case. And I think that it depends on many factors. And again, not being local, I don't know the specific things that would make a difference here. But there are lots of strategies that people use to make sure that events can be, now we have live streaming, now we have, possibilities of other kinds of venues. But I will say that sometimes it's a surprise to the very people who are in places, and I'll try to be very brief. I'm giving her the last word, that's why I'm talking first. We were together in Sweden, Stockholm, many years ago. We were in a national theater, something like this, and we were speaking, and all of a sudden, there were many Black women who were in the audience, and they started to speak. And what they told us was that they told us out loud, but they were really telling the people in the room about the kinds of racism they experience all the time, about the number of times they walk down the street or they're talking to someone and they are complimented on the fact that they speak Swedish when it's their first language, or they don't know about certain events, or people don't ask them certain questions. And often it's the case that people are brought in from outside of the country to speak, who are Black, to speak to the largely white population inside. So sometimes it is also in spaces like this, where people are present, that it becomes an occasion to do the very work that you're talking about. This is not so different from our situation, however, in the US, I will let you know. And despite the fact that on many occasions that we're always working to make sure that there's a difference in the ways that issues are engaged, we have the ongoing issues of access and privilege and linguistic and other that are a part of this problem. So we don't have the answers for you, but I know that you have the answers. So you should provide those answers that will work in your local context, but we also need to work together as a global problem on the way in which ideas are transmitted, the spaces in which they are shared, the direction of the vectors of communication, which don't tend to get reversed, for example, between global north and global south. Ideas are always being, shipped to the global south, but not necessarily moving the other way. These are all things that we have to learn to talk about in public more, and sometimes these events, as today, can be occasions to make those very points.
I was in Berlin a few weeks ago, I think in October, to participate in the 10th anniversary of a major demonstration that took place at Oranienplatz in Berlin. And some of you who've been following the movements of refugees and migrants may remember when that remarkable demonstration took place in Berlin. The point that I want to make as we close out is that that gathering in Berlin, which was organized by African women, women from South America. They live in some of them may be German citizens, and they live in Germany. But it was one of the most impressive demonstrations I've ever witnessed. It was organized by a group called International Woman Space. International Woman Space. I want to, as we close out, I want to point to the fact that women are rising up all over the world, and we're seeing a very different perspective as a result of this. That gathering, which was supposed to be 500 people, was more like 5,000. And diverse in a good way, I would say. And as I saw the women giving leadership to that amazing gathering, I was remembering, what's happening in Iran and Masa Amini, and the fact that the terrible suffering she had to undergo as a consequence of being charged with not wearing the hijab in a certain way, created a spark. And women, especially Kurdish women, all over Iran, are, for the first time in a very long time, openly challenging the state. And I don't want us to leave without recognizing that women are on the rise. Women are on the rise. And what is often different about anti-racist, anti-capitalist women's movements, feminist movements, is that, as they said so often in Brazil, when black women rise, the whole world rises with them. No one gets left behind.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all.